Our reading today is a brief selection from the Christian New Testament, from the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 14, verses 34 through 35. I think Sally meant for me to read this for it to be obviously ironic. It reads, "Let your women keep silence in church, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. And if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home. For it is a shame for women to speak in the church." Here ends our reading.
Thank you for that. When I was just starting out on my path toward ministry, actually the second time I ever preached in front of a congregation, it was at an unfamiliar church, and I met with the minister beforehand to talk about what to expect. Before any discussion of what I'd be preaching on, this minister asked what I planned to wear. And before I could answer, he went on to describe the many women he had seen preach in too tight dresses or too high heels, in too much makeup or too low necklines, wearing, God forbid, open-toed shoes or acrylic nails. "It's important to look dignified," he said, "authoritative." And what he didn't say hung very loudly in the air between us. That is, it's important not to remind anyone of your undignified, unauthoritative womanhood. And sitting in that office, I remember feeling suddenly very aware of my body, my t-shirt and skinny jeans, the chunky earrings I'd chosen to wear. Were they too much? Were they undignified? This Unitarian Universalist minister sits me down, and before addressing my thoughts or spirituality or plans for the future, he asks how I will look and details all the ways he thinks women specifically can look just wrong in the pulpit. And I know his intentions were good, right? His thoughtful, authoritative, you minister, I know he was only trying to help me, trying to give me advice he assumed I needed to hear, trying to give me advice as if I hadn't already been told in 1,000 different ways throughout my life that I would need to modulate everything about myself before anyone could listen to me or take me seriously. Lower my voice, wear different clothes, smile more or smile less, depending on who was giving the advice. In Unitarian Universalism today, more women are actually ordained than men. And yet, the default authoritative religious voice remains stubbornly gendered. I'm talking about the gut-level, pre-verbal image of a leader that sits in our heads, whether we like it or not. What does the voice of God sound like? Is it squeaky? Or is it deep? Who do we picture when we think of the pastor, the shepherd, the priest, the minister? The authoritative religious voice is, for many of us, still not a feminine one. And this isn't something that can be simplified to a matter of men versus women. People of all genders struggle on some gut level to accept feminine leadership as legitimate. We live in the society we live in, and I know I'm just as guilty as any other person. The church I grew up in had the same minister since before I was born till after I graduated high school, Reverend Bill Haney, a thoughtful and kind-hearted man with a fringe of white beard and an academic sensibility. And when he retired, it had still never really occurred to me that a woman might replace him. The first woman minister I remember seeing in the pulpit was Reverend Molly Hausch Gordon in 2012. And it blew my world wide open. I suppose I knew in some abstract sense that women could preach, but without immediate examples, my brain had gone ahead and filled the category minister with entirely male faces. If Reverend Molly had not shown up in my life when she did, I would have never thought to follow this path myself or to aspire to this type of authority. There's still something newfangled feeling about women ministers. Still a note of surprise when I tell someone who I am, what I do, when I show up in a congregant's hospital room and tell the nurse I'm one of their ministers. But it isn't newfangled at all. Our imaginations are actually lagging far behind our reality on this. So today, in celebration of International Women's Day, I'm going to tell you about one of my favorite chapters in our UU history, a reminder that our tradition has always contained space for unexpected sources of inspiration and leadership. We can look to the past to help us envision a better future. Because there was a time in American history when a group of women grabbed hold of Unitarian ministry and made it their own. I'm not talking the 2000s or the 1970s. I'm talking the 1880s. After the Civil War, in the wilds of the upper Midwest, a group of women rose up and began to build and fill pulpits that their East Coast brethren never dreamed of. That area of the country was still backwoods and prairies, mostly populated by farming families of Lutherans and Baptists. Even as Unitarianism and Universalism flourished on the coast, particularly in Boston, very few of our ministers were attracted to the small paychecks and hard life of ministry in the Midwest. One little girl born in Hamilton, Illinois in 1852, Eleanor Gordon, was going to change all that. Eleanor was born into a family with strong Unitarian leanings. At home, she read Ralph Waldo Emerson and Theodore Parker. And at age 10, she and her friend Mary Safford walked out of their Presbyterian Sunday school, having decided there was nothing being taught there that they cared to learn anymore. As she wrote later in life, I had two hands, a brain of my own. No one should dictate as to my ways or means. Eleanor and her friend Mary both grew into strong-willed intellectuals, prolific readers and supporters of the more radical branches of liberal religion. Eleanor became a teacher, one of the few career paths available to women, but she began to feel a growing call toward something else. She wrote, "There had been growing in my own mind a great discontent. While I loved to teach, I felt the need of a lesson greater than found in a school textbook." She wrote that she wanted to win a place in the larger school, the church. For many, a woman going into ministry was unimaginable, absurd, impossible, but Eleanor persisted, and her obvious skills and dedication gradually won support from the free-thinking Midwestern Unitarian communities taking root outside the hierarchy and social strictures of the more civilized East Coast. Finally, in 1889, the Unitarian Congregation of Sioux City, Iowa, officially ordained Eleanor Gordon as their minister. She was 37 years old. She and Mary Safford, also ordained at this point, wasted no time in building radical and loving church communities across the Midwest. They preached fiery sermons about the value of critiquing the Bible. They performed weddings and refused to include the word obey in any vows. They taught Darwin and Emerson in their Sunday schools. And perhaps most radically, they sought out and raised up new female talent, eventually gathering a loose network of about 24 ordained women, all founding and leading churches of their own, spreading the Unitarian message across the Great Plains. They called themselves the Iowa Sisterhood. Back in Boston, these Iowa sisters were largely considered an embarrassment, a distraction from the real work of theological debate and biblical interpretation. One notable difference between those prairie churches and the churches here in New England was the physical space. Here, pews were straight-backed or private pew boxes. Sanctuaries were often drafty and undecorated. Church was a place where you came to hear a sermon and little else. Comfort didn't enter into it. The ministers of the Iowa Sisterhood, on the other hand, began to build spaces deliberately designed to be welcoming, warm, home-like, a place where community might spend time and get to know each other. This led to these ministers being dismissed as glorified homemakers, sad spinsters caring for the church instead of for their own families. Nevertheless, they persisted. Eleanor wrote, "A woman must rid herself of the notion that she is a peculiar creature. She must believe herself a human mind with only the limitations of a human mind, a part of the universal mind with all possibilities of growth and development." The Iowa Sisterhood's churches grew and branched into new communities and grew again. And as the 20th century began, these thriving and growing congregations began to attract the attention of some of those Harvard-educated seminarians on the East Coast. The Plain States were no longer quite as harsh and inhospitable as they once were. And the president of the American Unitarian Association, Sam Elliott, declared that what the movement needed now was, quote, "more resolute men, not more women." One by one, the members of the Iowa Sisterhood were pushed out of the churches they had built. And by 1910, nearly all the Unitarian congregations of the Midwest were led by men. Most of the women ministers couldn't find other pulpits willing to have them and turned to other work as educators and activists, often in the suffrage movement. Eleanor Gordon and Mary Safford founded one more church in Orlando, Florida, before retiring. And with that, the Iowa Sisterhood dissolved and was largely forgotten. The number of ordained Unitarian women fell to nearly zero, and our movement's vision of who could lead us shrank back down to a narrow version of traditional, authoritative, dignified ministry. It wasn't until the 1970s and 80s that feminist historians and scholars rediscovered and lifted up the story of these radical Midwestern ministers. And in the last 40 years, the proportion of UU ministers who are women has gone from 6% to just over 50%. What was old is made new again, and it turns out this newfangled trend of women leading our movement actually has deep roots in our history. I know that our theme this month is the future, so it may seem odd to be telling a story that took place more than a century ago. But the story of the Iowa Sisterhood reminds us to listen for the voices at the fringe of our tradition today. Who are the UUs today who dream of preaching to backwoods and margins? The ones who will shake up the way we do weddings and Sunday school and how we build our sacred spaces. And are we still pushing them out of our pulpits? How many other aspiring ministers are being sat down for conversations like the one I had when I first started preaching? Conversations about what they need to wear, what they need to look like and sound like if they want to be taken seriously. What are we really saying when we describe a preacher as undignified or unprofessional or shrill? It might take a little discomfort, but I truly believe it's better to have every Sunday of the year preached by people in too tight dresses and undignified earrings than to go that same year only hearing one type of voice from the pulpit. And sure, I'm annoyed when I hear an up-talker who can't get through a sentence without questioning her own authority. But that doesn't mean I should dismiss the actual content of the words that she's trying to get out. And these days, gender is only the beginning. The leaders of tomorrow will not look like the leaders of today. They will be surprising, unexpected. They will be genderqueer, Black, disabled, loudly and publicly different from the mold, different in ways we might not be able to predict and prepare for. When our imaginations catch up with reality, when our image of what a leader looks like expands beyond the white-haired, dark-robed men who fill our lists of past ministers, we will be moving into a future that is wide open and hopeful beyond our foremothers' wildest dreams. We are, all of us, dancing Sarah's circle, sisters, brothers, siblings, all. Every round, a generation. What we lose, we can find again. May we keep the door open to those who come after us. May we lift up those who came before. May the circle keep on turning, and may it bring us to the future we envision. Amen.